spent a lot of time here. So I'll talk a little bit about this book, which I'm very pleased. It seems that when I wrote it in nautical terms, and it's going to be too specialized, but somehow it's hit a chord with both sailors, but people who love language and whatever. Oh, and Anakin, I meant to mention you. Thank you so much for getting this all put together. And Derek, who I just met, who's great. So anyway, anyway, seems to have struck a chord, and I was very pleased. My publisher just let me know the other day that it's called printing. So yeah. And just a little bit, I grew up in Bronxville and went to Smith College, and then briefly went to law school at University of Virginia, and that wasn't for me, so I ended up going to book publishing at Doubleday and HarperCollins. So this is really my first time on the author side of the fence. So the background of the book was my dad, who grew up on the North Shore and sailed a wooden dinghy. He had it drilled into him, if there's ever an accident, always stay with the boat. 2 decades later, he was in the D-Day invasion of France, and his patrol craft was sunk by a German shore battery 8,000 yards off Utah Beach. So I always had to call my dad on his birthday, but June 6th was a close second in terms of the importance. So the English Channel waters were frigid 48 degrees that day in June 1944. The crew that chose to swim away from the ship died of hypothermia. The ones that clung to the hull, including my father, were eventually rescued. Growing up, my dad's love of naval language and the sea permeated our house. He told us how our great-grandfather, the whaler out of Cold Spring Harbor, rounded Cape Horn 3 times. So as a kid, that's enough to fire your imagination. Somehow, wherever Cape Horn was, it sounded intrepid. And when he woke us 5 kids every morning for school, the greeting wasn't it wasn't good morning, but it was rise and shine, which is the traditional morning call for the crew to wake up, hit the deck, and be ready to take orders. At bedtime, my father often stood silhouetted in my doorway and sang taps. Its lyrics, its lyrics are as soothing to a child as they are to a soldier. And years later, I became fascinated by how our conversation is saturated with nautical words and phrases, and how unaware we are that we're speaking the language of sailors. Unlike maritime expressions, when we hear a sports metaphor, we know it. Phrases like down for the count, the ball's in their court, it's a slam dunk, are so obvious to us, we not only get that it's a sports expression, we know what's sport. When the Yankees or the Mets win every game in a series, it's a clean sweep. But who knows that the expression clean sweep was coined by the Dutch Admiral Martin Tromp after his crushing defeat of the British in the 1652 Battle of Dungeness. In a fit of bravado, Tromp fixed a broom to the masthead to signal that he had swept the British from the seas. And baseball fans today carry brooms to the ballpark to urge their team on in the final game of the series. In your wheelhouse is another nautically inspired sports metaphor. On a ship, the wheelhouse is where everything is within reach of the pilot. Likewise, a baseball batter who gets a pitch right in his zone, his wheelhouse is likely to blast it out of the park. And recently I was in Carl Schurz Park in Manhattan and overheard a man telling his grandson, "We are going to walk to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's a mile away as the crow flies." We use the expression "as the crow flies" all the time, but without knowing that this term, which implies the most direct route somewhere, was coined at sea. When a ship was lost in coastal waters, sailors shimmied up the mast and released a crow from the cage. The crow flew straight towards the nearest shore, and the lookout platform, as I think we all know, was called the crow's nest. And on a typical summer long weekend, those who stay in the city see everyone cut and run for the country by lunchtime. Today's meaning of the phrase cut and run reflects its original maritime sense. In order to make a quick escape, a captain ordered his crew to cut anchor lines and lashings of furled sails so the ship could quickly get underway and run with the wind. This maneuver was only acceptable under dire circumstances, since a lost anchor and damaged rigging was costly. And folks in New York on a beautiful 4th of July might find themselves at loose ends. Loose ends, it really is such an odd phrase, yet we don't really question why we use it when we describe being really at a loss to do with ourselves. Its origin comes from the experience of a period of relative calm at sea, when idle sailors were ordered to repair and splice the frayed ends of lines. Those assigned this tedious task were described as being at loose ends. And I'm sure many of you have probably been in Manhattan during the Fleet Week. That every June, the sailors are in town. So it's during New York's annual Spring Fleet Week that people who work in Midtown see sailors and officers walking around in their pressed white uniforms. The young sailors were in their classic white Dixie cup hats, and wide bell bottoms are a reminder of how much our fashion has been influenced by the Navy. A lot of us associate bell bottoms with the 1960s, and it was hippies who bought up surplus Navy bell bottoms. But before these pants became a countercultural fashion statement, they were the signature mark of a sailor's uniform. Invented by mariners, these dark blue serge trousers flared out at a wide bell shape below the knee, making it easy to roll the pant leg above the knees when slobbing the deck. The ubiquitous blue blazer, got its start in the mid-1800s when British naval officers often used their own money to purchase uniforms for their crew. And it was Captain John Washington of the ship HMS Blazer who chose a striking blue and white uniform for his men. Originally, his crew was known as the Blazers. Before the Royal Navy rolled out official uniforms in 1857, recruits were so shabbily dressed in their patched, threadbare clothing that even the low-quality garments that they bought from the ship store were a step up. Their most common purchase was baggy pants called slops. The word sloppy comes from the Middle English word sloppe, meaning baggy underwear. Given today's tight-fitting fashions, those of us who opt for comfortable, loose clothing can be dismissed by fashionistas as being sloppy. And in terms of sloppy or fashion, I always think of the North Fork as a little more casual than and the Hamptons and the South Fork, a little more formal. Fleet Week also brings to my mind another expression in the book. I was walking along Manhattan's Vanderbilt Avenue during this past Fleet Week when 4 young sailors came out of Grand Central Terminal. I asked to take their picture, and to my amazement, really, by the time I got my phone up, the 4 men had positioned themselves perfectly aligned, shoulder to shoulder, and the tips of their black high-polished shoes were absolutely perfectly aligned. So what they were doing was towing the line. For us to be told to toe the line, it's a negative. It's something we have to do, but don't want to. When a captain commanded the crew to attention, he expected uniformity and precision. Sailors sailors are lined up with their toes touching the seams of the planking, and a sailor not standing upright and in proper alignment was ordered to toe the line. When I said goodbye to the 4 sailors, they asked me where the Empire State Building was. And so most of us think as the Empire State Building is really New York's most iconic skyscraper. What we might not realize is that the original skyscrapers were not tall buildings, but the highest sail on a tall ship. And these were small, triangular, very light fabric sails that were light cloth sails that are really only used in very fair winds. And the disconnect between our frequent use of sailing terms and how little we are aware of it shows how removed we've become from the time when the world traveled by sail. Until recent history, walking or horseback were the slow, plodding options for overland travel. But on the sea, ships could harness the wind at astonishing speeds. And the heart of the great coastal cities were their harbors. Even those who never left home witnessed the bustle of ships disgorging cargo, setting sail, and weighing anchor. And those who lived along the Mediterranean coast saw another common sight. Because an approaching ships might, whether naval or commercial, could often pose terrible, huge health risks, any vessel suspected of carrying infectious diseases was required to sit at anchor offshore for 40 days. The name of this waiting period comes from the Latin quatresima, meaning 40 days. So during our pandemic, the word, as we all know, quarantine, peppered most of our conversations. Yet so few of us realize the word originated from a similar health threat faced centuries ago. There was a nautical literacy that is absent today. When you read the classics, the classic maritime works, there's an assumption that the reader will understand. Mutiny on the Bounty remains a beloved classic despite our detachment to a lot of its nautical language. In chapter 4, when a storm is threatening, the authors described how, quote, the hatches were constantly battened down and the forward deck began to leak. Bligh gave orders that people should sling their hammocks in the back great cabin aft. And one might not exactly know what hatches or battens are, and one might not know that aft is the back of the ship, but the phrase batten down the hatches is a completely understandable term we use today. For us, it means to prepare for trouble. Batten comes from the old French baston, meaning a stick or flat strip of wood, and in foul weather, crew members, like those on the Bounty, stretched tarpaulins over the hatches and pinned down the edges with battens. Shakespeare drew on references to the sea so often that there's an entire book devoted to it called Shakespeare's Sea Terms Explained. And the fascinating thing, I love Shakespeare, what he does, unlike the romantic poets like Wordsworth or Keats, he writes like a sailor. Somehow he grew up inland and at agrarian England, inland far away, but he uses nautical language with absolute precision. So this Shakespeare's Sea Terms Explained is entirely devoted to deciphering them. Violent storms, tides, shipwrecks, and sea nymphs can determine a character's fate, literally or metaphorically. In the play King John, the king's soliloquy in Act 5 reveals how often Shakespeare layers symbolic meaning onto literal seafaring terminology. And in his soliloquy, King John laments, the tackle of my heart is cracked and burned, and all these shrouds wherewith my life should sail are turned to one thread, one little hair. My heart hath one poor string to stay it by. Without understanding the maritime meaning of tackle, shrouds, and stay, it's difficult to appreciate the meaning and power of these lines. Some nautical terms we use today are so removed that we've completely lost their original meaning. When you have a cold, you might call in work and say, I'm under the weather. But why in the world do we say that? For sailors, it meant standing watch on the windward side of the ship and being battered by wind and spray. Getting the brunt of rough and tough seas is to be under the weather. On the other hand, one part of the ship we all know is the sails. Sails harness the wind at astonishing speeds, and it's all designed from its hull to its mast to allow the sails to catch the maximum amount of wind. There's a lot going on a sailing ship, and it's mostly to do with the canvas. It's not surprising that so many expressions relate to them. The phrase get cracking describes how mail ships, and I know we had a lot of packets out of this part of the island, centuries ago. Anyway, so the phrase "get cracking" describes how mail ships, needing to avoid penalties for late delivery, carried the maximum amount of sail and set the rigging so tautly that it made a cracking noise under the tension. And we've all reported with satisfaction that we've taken the wind out of some pompous person's sail. This figurative meaning nicely parallels the original nautical one that describes a maneuver by which one boat passes windward and close to another boat so as to block the breeze from the other's sails. It's humiliating for captains to lose speed and have their sails sag. One of the most daunting tasks of new crew members was to know the ropes. Tall ships had miles of rigging, and each had its own function. It was critical for sailors to correctly identify each one, since securing or lashing the wrong line could be disastrous. Much of our language reflects naval military action and hardware. In the 18th century, navies forced oncoming ships to identify themselves by firing a cannon over their bow, cannon shot. If the approaching ship hoisted enemy colors, an attack might ensue. Today, a shot across the bow means to get a rise out of somebody. And we might accuse an impulsive friend behind his or her back of being a loose cannon. When a ship cannon accidentally broke away from its mount in heavy weather, it was a catastrophic event. The cannon rolled uncontrollably around the deck, just harming and crushing everything in its path. In his novel, 93, Victor Hugo captures this horrific moment. And he writes, "Something terrible had just happened. One of the cannonades, a battery, a 24-pounder, had broken loose. This is the most dangerous accident that can possibly take place on shipboard. A cannon that breaks its moorings suddenly becomes some strange supernatural beast." And in a folksy way, we might call somebody a son of a gun. But what sons come from a gun? The nautical origin of this expression is one of the most colorful I came across while researching the book. When British warships began allowing women on board, the consequences were obvious. Since sailors had no privacy below deck, babies were often conceived and delivered within the relatively secluded spaces between the ship's guns. When paternity was unknown, the child was entered into the ship's log as son of a gun. And this one was theater music. And then I found a diary in the New York Yacht Club, and in it, the 1835 diary of a Captain W.N. Glasscock that recounted just this kind of event. He writes, "The surgeon informed me that a woman on board had been laboring for 12 hours, and if I could permit the firing of broadside, nature would be assisted by the shock. I complied, and she was delivered of a fine male child." A recent New York Times op-ed page accused Chief Justice Roberts of turning a blind eye to ethical conduct on the court. This is a popular expression, really the one I hear as much as any of them. And it was the British Admiral Nelson who inspired the phrase, "turn a blind eye." In one of naval history's most celebrated acts of insubordination, in the heat of battle, Admiral Nelson raised his telescope to his blind eye and announced he could not see the signal flag, commanding him to break off action. And as the story goes, which I think it is true, Nelson told his captain, "You know fully, I have only one eye, and I have a right to be blind sometimes." But of course, since Nelson pulled off yet another spectacular victory, naval superiors naturally turned a blind eye to his disobedience. While writing Three Sheets to the Wind, I spent a lot of time in the New York Public Library. And I hadn't originally planned to include literary passages in the book, but as my research continued, I kept bumping into the great maritime writers like Homer, Melville, Forster, and O'Brien. These writers all reached for the language of sailors. Some of the most unique research I did was in the library of the New York Yacht Club. So when I was a kid, I would often, this is a direct route on 44th Street to the theater district, which my parents sometimes took it to me to. So I would pass this club off Fifth Avenue on 44th many, many times. And I was curious about a landlocked yacht club smack dab in the middle of the widest girth of the Manhattan street grid. And even more curious to me was the architects Warren and Wetmore. And these are the same architects that designed Grand Central Terminal. And what they did with the yacht club, New York Yacht Club, was a use of form and function, and they created an exterior that mimics the tempest-tossed stern of ships, complete with bay windows, dripping foam, and framed by an elegant tangle of dolphins, seaweed, garlands, and seashells. And it literally juts the back of this brochure juts onto the sidewalk above you. And the club's library has wood paneling, hanging sconces, and slightly creaking floorboards. It feels like a ship. The only giveaway is the absence of motion. I'm not a member, but they allow researchers to use their library, which holds one of the finest maritime collections in the world. I almost finished researching the book, but I felt I hadn't done my due diligence until I went to the Strand bookstore on Lower Broadway. It was in their dusty maritime basement section that I discovered the book Mark Well the Whale, about the history of the whalemen of Long Island. In it were whaling stories about my great-grandfather, George Washington Barrett, and his two brothers. It's also the first time I really saw they had etchings, a real likeness of them. So this was a real eureka moment. And the youngest of the sailing brothers, whaling, was Freeman, and he got his leg caught in a harpoon line during a whale chase in the Pacific. The whale dragged him down several fathoms before he was able to cut the line with his sheath knife. He died of internal injuries just months after he returned to Cold Spring Harbor. He was 37. And it's this kind of early death we speak of as unfathomable. The word fathom, like so many nautical phrases, expresses emotion. Originally, fathom was a unit of measurement based on the span of a man's outstretched arms. Sailors measured ocean depths, anchor chains, and cables in fathoms. But mariners eventually abandoned fathoms for meters, but we on shore still reach for the word fathom to express our ability to comprehend, grasp, or get to the bottom of things. Words like feeling blue, listless, and in the doldrums also come from the sea. When we say I'm in the doldrums, we admit to being in an apathetic state of mind. In literal geographic terms, the doldrums is a belt of low pressure 5 degrees above and below the equator. And sailors who were trapped in this, just in irons, going nowhere, much like the Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner captures this beautifully. Anyway, in this windless quarter, they just became listless as their ship. The name eventually of a dreaded place became, for us, the name of a dreaded emotion. Many books I came across weren't relevant to my research, but were nonetheless fascinating. One title from the early 1900s called Naval Phraseology turned out to be a kind of preppy handbook for boating etiquette. It includes a chapter titled Courteous Expressions, and in it are such exchanges as, I come on board with your permission, sir. It is a pleasure to receive you, sir. Or, may I present myself? I am so-and-so. I'm delighted to make your acquaintance. Many thanks for your kindness. Please don't mention it. Can I offer you a cup of tea? Yes, thank you. I should like a cup very much. It's a more mannerly time. And since this is one of my favorite subjects, I'd like to end with some nautical food and drink phrases. So salt tern meat was a staple of long sea voyages. While chewing tough, briny beef, sailors exchanged stories and chewed the fat. Similarly, when we chew the fat, we're exchanging friendly banter and gossip. The ship's crew also swapped information around the scuttlebutt. A butt was a large wooden cask And on long voyages, water was rationed by carving a hole in the barrel side so that it could only be half filled. A cask with a hole was scuttled. So not much has changed except we now gossip around a water cooler. And in rough weather, there was no time for gossip. The busy crew ate whatever food they could just stash in their pocket. They were up in the rigging. But at anchor or in fair weather, they were often served meals on square boards. The shape of the square shape made for easy stacking and stowing. And a square meal today, for us, is much the same good, hearty food. Many of our colorful expressions about drinking come from, not surprisingly, waterfront alehouses. The phrase make a toast traces back to coastal taverns where a popular drink among sailors was a small piece of toast placed in a mulled wine or hot toddy. And the admonishment to mind your P's and Q's and be on your best behavior is ironically rooted in the rough and tumble world of drinking establishment. Sailors favored tavern keepers who offered credit. To keep these tabs accurate, the owners wrote the names of each customer on a board, and next to it the number of P's, pints, and Q's, quarts, drunk by each sailor. And tavern keepers, of course, made sure each sailor paid up on payday. And then there's the expression, free sheets to the wind. This phrase, which inspired the title of my book, stems from the similarity between a sailing ship moving erratically because its sheets are loose and flying in the wind, and a drunken sailor staggering about. And for better or for worse, the U.S. Navy days of rum, beer, and literally officers with their personal wine supply ended abruptly in 1914. And this is when the stern Methodist teetotaler named Josephus Daniels became Secretary of the Navy. Once he was appointed, he promptly banned alcohol on all ships, Navy yards, and Navy stations. And as a substitute, stewards increased orders for coffee. So Navy lore has it that the disgruntled sailors tagged the poor substitute cup of Josephus Daniels and later the shorter cup of Joe. But the expression three sheets the wind endures in our everyday speech and in such beloved classics as Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. The character Long John Silver denies he's drunk. And he says, maybe you think we are all a sheet in the wind's eye, but I tell you I was sober. So as long as Treasure Island remains a beloved maritime classic, people will be accusing each other of being three sheets to wind. So thank you. That's kind of just the tip of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg of the nautical work terms that we really do use every day. When I was writing the book, I think I annoyed my friends because every time they mentioned the word filibuster or slush fund or I said, that's the book, that's the book. Well, thank you all so much for being here. You've been a wonderful audience. Questions or anything you want to share about Sam? Yes.
Where are you on your speaking tour? Is it?
Yeah.
Have you been out have you been taking the book? You've gone to the New York Yacht Club?
Yeah.
My brother, one of the oldest members.
Oh, really? Maybe.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, are you fairly far along in this? Because you have a real future going on. Like you're running yacht clubs and
the New York Yacht Club was wonderful. The quartermaster assigned me a room for the night, the dining room, that wonderful sort of, facsimile of a ship. So so a lot up and down the eastern seaboard. Last Thursday I was in Baltimore at a club called the Mount Vernon Club. So and here it's been fantastic. Here and the East End Maritime Museum, the Orient Yacht Club. So the reception here has been fantastic.
You should do the New York Yacht Club in Newport.
That would be nice. Happily volunteer for that. Okay, that would be fantastic. I haven't had, but yeah, well, thanks.
Where was most of the book read?
Really in my apartment
Good, man.
and rarely in summer because summer I was out here. So it took a while to get it done. But cold winter days, and it was just wonderful to go to to the yacht club for research. You go from a corporate setting, it's amazing. So your brother is
Well, the oldest.
fantastic. Well, I'll talk to you. Yeah,
That's,
the nice water though.
uh-huh.
Yeah. So any other, hi Ann.
So did it lead to any more insights into your family background?
As I said, a lot of things I never knew coming across books. And then early on, before the book was published, I went to the Whaling Museum in Cold Spring Harbor and we did some research there. And I'd been there when I was little, but what impressed me was that the main street, how unchanged it was, because there was my great grandfather's home. Practically next door was DeWitt Barrett, his brother, who became a whaling captain eventually, and also from New Bedford, and even shipmates. It was all and some Portuguese or a lot of Portuguese, so it was all intertwined. But what really got me was I was leaving the whaling museum and crossing kind of category on Main Street, and I saw it's nice. They have a lot of plaques on the homes, and I saw a plaque and it said Artemis Barrett, sailor and gamekeeper, shepherd and gamekeeper. And I was like, that is amazing. I mean, it kind of sent chills. That was my great great grandfather with his home still standing, Artemis. And it also solved sort of a family mystery. He had been, we were told, a shepherd on Martha's Vineyard. And we loved that because sometimes we got to go there. So the lore has it that one night he's with his sheep and there's a ghost coming out of an open grave. That was absolutely it. But then it turns out, of course, it was a sheep that was stuck and just wiggling around. So the fact it said shepherd and gamekeeper was really quite moving. Answer. Anybody else have any comments? Yeah.
What's the relationship to your illustrator?
Oh, that's my brother. He's an illustrator and a pastel landscape artist, but he's a fantastic cartoonist and line artist. So I had to coax him into it, but it was great to work with him. It was very fun. Yeah. It's interesting. Not many people ask that question.
What was the original idea? It's a your eureka moment where you're like, I gotta write a book about this.
Just hearing these phrases so often,
Uh-huh.
and I just really want people to know. And I just love the sea. I love sailing. So yeah, that kind of film.
You should go on cruise ships.
Yes.
That would be good too. Can you name that up?
I mean, you publish it on an arrange it for
I
you.
know that would be
I mean,
nice.
just free room and board for a week.
That would be very nice. Well,
It's worth it, I think.
I'll get my agent to work. Trying to go to sea, but yeah, I've gone. Let's see, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Bedford was a wonderful place to.
Yeah.
There's a picture of a ship on dry dock called the Sunbeam. And it's a huge whaling ship, very impressive. And that was the Rick Barrett's boat. He was captain of it. So it's just been fascinating. Yeah. Well, I'd be happy to sign books if anybody's interested, or it's also available on Amazon. So yes, but thanks so much, everybody. And I want some food and drink, and I'm happy to do it. Tell me if you're going to be. No, precisely. It's